So now let me introduce to you the day's opening speaker, a very distinguished guest, Amy Pope, Director General of the International Organization for Migration. Appointed in October 2023, Amy Pope brought energy and new vision to the IOM, focusing on the modern realities and challenges of displacement and resettlement, though, of course, in the past months has also experienced organizational realities and challenges in the moment. Before joining IOM, Ms. Pope was a senior advisor on migration to President Biden and served as a deputy Homeland Security advisor to President Obama. I would be remiss if I didn't also add that Ms. Pope is a graduate of Haverford College, my alma mater, and I think one of the smallest universities on the planet, with about 1,300 students total. So it's a rare moment to cross paths with a fellow traveler from long ago, which I celebrate. And so it's my pleasure and honor to now present to you IOM Director General Amy Pope, who has also graciously agreed after her comments to take a few questions from the audience. Thank you, Ms. Pope. Turn to you.
Thank you, Mario, a fellow Haverford alum. It's true we don't see many of them around the world. And of course, thanks to you, Alex, and to Kevin Appleby, who's a former colleague and friend from my days working on the Hill, and whose invitation is the one that persuaded me to be part of this as we try to respond to the current pressures that drive people to move all around the world and also to come up with more humane policies to do so. I mean, let me just start with something we all know that is true, but I think we just have to keep saying it over and over again. Migration is normal. Migration is human. Every single one of us, every single one of you sitting in that room has a migration story somewhere in your background. And it's just not just in the United States. I mean, if we look at the development of human civilization, we would not have it without migration. And I feel that it's critically important that we come back to that over and over, because that the shared history of humankind, the common ground we can all find, somehow is being lost in the conversation today. And of course, migration is complex, it's multifaceted, we're seeing different pressures drive people to move. But in reality, not so long ago, every single one of us had ancestors who moved. And I think understanding that, driving conversations around a human response is critical. I was last week, I actually just got back on Saturday from Sudan. And I'm sure you're seeing in the news how terrible the situation is there. I mean, literally 90,000 people have been displaced in the last 10 days. This is on top of 10 million people who've already been displaced because of the conflict there. This is the largest crisis of displacement in the world. And in Sudan, you see an extreme version of what's been playing out around the world. We have political instability, we have violence. Some of it is related to conflict, some of it is related to people's ethnic or tribal identities. Some people are caught in the middle. And we have the impact of climate. So in some places, drought, in some places, flooding. And you get a conflation of pressures like that, and people do what people have done for centuries. They move. And that is the first human adaptation strategy. And I know my ancestors fleeing the extreme poverty in Sweden and at the end of the 1800s, and finding a place to create a new life and build support for their children in the United States are just one example of what we see play out all around the world. Now, I do think it's critical that we kind of pull apart what is irregular migration and what is regular migration and figure out how we can start to come up with solutions that are more responsive to the situation people are facing. You know, if you're watching the news, or many of you are practitioners, you've seen it firsthand. I've heard it firsthand, stories of people who have crossed through jungles under extraordinary circumstances, who have climbed into boats that are not anywhere close to seaworthy, who have figured out how to get across a desert, sometimes at huge human cost. And we have tremendous compassion and understanding for the people who are taking these journeys, but we shouldn't pretend that that's a good thing. People are taking these desperate measures because they're in desperate circumstances. And somehow we've come into a situation where everybody accepts that people are going to move through smugglers and traffickers on boats or across deserts without really getting to what's driving that migration, and isn't there a better way that we can enable the movement of people? For the last several decades, we are just responding to the symptoms of that movement rather than addressing the root causes of it. And I think it is actually critical for communities who work on the issue of migration to recognize that we can be against irregular migration, that we can be against smugglers and traffickers, and we can be for just humane migration policies. And when we bifurcate and we suggest that there's only one camp or another camp, you're either for migration or against it, it's actually increasing tensions. And particularly, it's increasing tensions at borders where we're seeing communities feel the stress of the movement of people. And that's not in the United States alone, that's all over the world, whether it's somewhere like Niger or Libya or places like Pakistan and Afghanistan. So taking apart those tensions, addressing them in a more humane, comprehensive, strategic way is absolutely essential. And it shouldn't be at the cost of saying that this suggestion, this polarization between whether a government has the right to manage their own borders shouldn't really even come into the conversation. Of course, governments have a right to manage their own border. They have an obligation. Their citizens expect them to manage their borders. But it is also perfectly legitimate for the public to expect that border management to be both efficient and effective and humane. And where much of the breakdown we see comes from, and I know you all have seen this in the US when it comes to the polling, is when people perceive there's chaos or mismanagement, when they see border communities under stress, it turns people who would otherwise be for better migration policies against often the migrants themselves. And we see that, again, this is not specific to any one country. We are seeing it play out all around the world. And I want to be clear, this is actually terrible news for the migrants themselves. That we've seen the number of migrant deaths along migration routes rising to record levels. Last year, 9,000 people died. And you all, that's just the 9,000 we have recorded. We believe actually the number is quite higher. And we hear regularly of the horrific exploitation and abuse that migrants are facing. I've spoken to migrants in Libya who have been detained and held for ransom, people whose families sold their houses in order, or their land or their property, or crowdsourced to try to cobble together enough money to enable a migrant to be ransomed out, to be freed. I was in Guatemala where I met a 60-year-old woman who told me how she had been detained. She was headed through Mexico. She was detained by a cartel. She didn't have the money to pay their ransom, so they forced her to work as a cook and a cleaner. And ultimately, her family scraped together thousands of dollars, but it took them 6 months to do it. And the entire time she was working as a cook and a cleaner for the smugglers. We see it again and again that smugglers and trafficking rings are taking advantage of extremely vulnerable people, abusing them, treating them as a commodity, and really exploiting their desperation. And they're often people who, as you all so well know, are often have so little and very little rights, very little understanding of law, very little understanding of networks. So my hope is that in the context of this conversation and the work that you all are doing, is that we can move away from this bifurcated, black and white assessment of the movement of people, and really drive something that is more than about managing numbers, and drive a conversation, drive outcomes that's more than just about enforcement. I see again around the world that if we're going to really drive better, smarter, more strategic movements of people, we have to rethink our system. We have to be engaging with the countries that people are coming from, as well as the countries they would transit through, as well as the countries of destination. And we have to recognize that where people have options, where they can move in a more regular, legal way, when they know what those options are, when they have access to the resources and the networks to apply for jobs, for example, they do so. I have not met one migrant who said to me, oh yeah, I just decided that I would pay a smuggler because that just seemed better, right? Everybody wants to find ways to move safely and legally, and to do so, not all from the south to the north. I mean, it's often within regional economic communities. It's often within the area they come from. Sometimes it's a next door country. So I think it's to really start by understanding why people are moving, what's driving them to move, and figuring out a comprehensive way for people to do so safely. Now, I say that because we are in 2025, IOM is about to celebrate its 75th anniversary. But so many of the tools that we now rely on are still the tools from the 1950s, the tools that were put forward in the wake of World War II. And when we look at the world in the 1950s to the world that we have now, it's nowhere close. So the fact that we still rely on these very outdated systems is the first piece that we need to address. Now, the importance of protecting the right to asylum and the Refugee Convention, from our assessment, that is not only critical, but unless we come up with new ways of responding to the migration trends that exist today, we will not be able to protect the refugee protections that now exist. Because what we do see around the world is that the asylum pathway often offers the safest, fastest, most efficient pathway for people, regardless of whether they will apply or ultimately qualify, which then not only undermines the public support for asylum, but also then makes the asylum process longer and less effective and less efficient. So we believe very strongly, based on what we're seeing play out all across the world, that asylum, in order to protect asylum, in order to protect the Refugee Convention, we have to respond to the various movements of people that we're seeing all over the world. So a couple of factors we think play into what a working model of migration will look like. First of all, we have to recognize this link between development and migration. We see it all the time. Poor development outcomes fuel migration, especially irregular migration. If you cannot get a job at home, if the governance is weak, if there's local violence, but the police are not responsive, people move. They move for new economic opportunities, job opportunities. They move for safety. Now, the flip side is also true. When they move, when people get a job somewhere else, it actually fuels development. And we see it around the world. The migrants' remittances are boosting developing economies. And there's a fantastic report that's been released by the World Bank just 2 years ago that details over and over again how migration fuels development. So there's a clear correlation and a clear causation, in fact, between migration, remittances, skills development, and the access to resources that leads to the development in the country that the migrant came from. It also is boosting the development outcomes in the places that migrants are going to. The second piece of this, so I'll just say there on that first one, we need to deliberately connect migration to development outcomes and see it as one tool that can help drive development and one tool that can be leveraged once you have migrants or diaspora communities around the world to faster reach development outcomes. Now, the second is one that should be evident to everybody in the room, but sadly the policies don't exist yet to make this so at the scale that is needed, is that the migration policies right now are insufficiently tied to growing labor demands. And we're seeing it because many of the people who are migrating irregularly are finding work in informal economies. We're also seeing, and we're seeing this play out around the world, there are sectors, both high skilled and low skilled, where there aren't sufficient workers within the domestic population. And so people, when they're migrating into a country, especially in the lower skilled work, agriculture, construction, hospitality, and healthcare, they are getting jobs, but they're not getting jobs with the same protections, with the same wages, with the same support that they would get if they got that job through the formal economy. That suggests a couple of things, including the fact that the migration policies that exist right now are not sufficient to address those economic and labor demands. And again, this is true across the world. We're seeing it play out across the Americas. We see it play out in Asia, in Europe, and of course, we've seen it play out in the United States. So the third piece of this is to say, okay, well, we know the connection between development and migration. We know that there's a demand for people to do work that's not yet being met by the national population. Can we then connect development funds towards skills training? We see this at places like Bangladesh. They're experimenting with having technical skills where migrants are getting training in things like childcare or car repair or healthcare. And in Germany, there's an initiative to train and recruit nurses internationally, which is good not just for Germany. Of course, they are desperate for nurses, as so many countries are, but actually that training is benefiting the recipient country. The idea being that we train more people than what any one market needs, and you're seeding competencies within the country of origin. The other piece of this is that trained workers need to be able to get jobs through an ethical channel, through a regular channel. And sometimes this means that we need to ensure that particularly recruiting firms, to the extent they are the primary mechanism for recruiting talent, are not passing on fees to the workers, are themselves compliant with ethical recruitment. We're also seeing some promising examples, for example, in Australia and Tuvalu, which is a small Pacific Island nation facing existential sea level rise. They now have a program where they're connecting the training and upskilling of potential workers from Tuvalu so that they can work in Australia as a climate adaptation strategy. And we're now at the moment seeing many countries negotiate labor mobility agreements. India is one notable example. Now, the key is that we need to build into the labor mobility agreements protections for workers, training for workers, capacity in the country where the worker is coming from. So if they face exploitation and abuse, they have a mechanism to seek help. And that's still not at the level it needs to be. The other thing, and this is something that we see governments fail to take into account all the time, is they tend to look at migration in isolation. It's kind of one ministry that is focused on getting visas and appropriate permits, but really fail to take into account the importance of engaging community leaders, local officials, private sector even, so that when migrants are coming into a community, they are being well integrated, and we're proactively thinking about the impact of schools or housing and infrastructure, and not waiting to see that impact. And you see that in places like Canada or Australia, where there's been a significant pressure on housing, which is now causing a backlash to migration policies. Now, of course, the housing shortage is not related solely to migrant numbers, but it is creating a backlash because there was never a comprehensive approach to their policies to attract talent. So it's not to say that if we do all of these four things, we're going to solve the world's problems, but it would start to tackle one of the pieces that's driving people to move. And of course, we all have seen the tremendous hit that the refugee resettlement program has taken in the United States, but elsewhere. And we all know that the refugee resettlement program was a tiny, tiny, tiny drop in the ocean for the people across the world who needed access to a better life or to better options. So to start to think about it more comprehensively, taking into account labor market needs, taking into account the importance of upskilling and training, is one window that has not been fully opened. The other thing is that if we can start to think about this more comprehensively, if we start to integrate it into an approach that is about protecting asylum, but is broader than just asylum, we do think this will reduce the need for smugglers and traffickers. It will drive people into a rules-based labor market where there will be appropriate oversight, where there will be appropriate assurance for and safeguards for people who are subject to exploitation or find themselves subjected to exploitation. It will promote public confidence. It will lead to increased prosperity in the economies that are able to take advantage of it. And ultimately, we think that this will enable more just and humane migration around the world. Now, I do want to take a moment to just distinguish. We talk about this route-based approach, ROUTE versus ROOT. When we're dealing with the kind of migration that IOM deals with, the roots of that migration are often economic. But when we're looking at some of the migration we're seeing around the world, the roots of that migration is conflict. And there has to be a way to drive forward political solutions to these conflicts that are driving extraordinary numbers of people to move. I mean, when I was in Sudan last week, I spoke to people who had absolutely no choice but to move fast and to move, and huge numbers of people were moving at once. And the stories they told were horrifying. Women and children primarily who were leaving because the men were not permitted to leave. They spoke about trying to dig trenches so that the drones wouldn't spot them and they wouldn't die. They saw their husbands basically snatched and detained or killed on sight. Many of them spoke about being sexually assaulted, including in front of their families, in front of their children. They spoke about people who couldn't move fast enough because of disability or weakness being left to die on the side of the road. And my strong view is that we have to come up with a better, more comprehensive migration approach, because there will always be these situations like Sudan or Ukraine, or you name any conflict we've seen in the last 75 years, where people need to move quickly and they need to find safety quickly. And we need to be able to differentiate movements so that the world has the capacity, the openness to provide refuge to those who are fleeing in these horrifying circumstances. We also need to keep in mind that the migration policies, you have the best asylum policies in the world, but ultimately, if we don't have a commitment to political solutions and to peace, all of this is just going to be a Band-Aid. So it's my hope that we can drive forward, even in this moment of deep polarization, even in this moment of very strong political differences, that there is room to find a better approach, and that it's critical that we find ways to work together, whether it's through the faith community or civil society, whether it's private sector, government partners, because I have seen it. People deserve better outcomes, better options. And frankly, the world needs it. The world needs better migration policies. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director General. Thank you very much for your remarks, for your vision, for your always humanizing of migration, and for your sense of hope. I think we have time for maybe just two questions, but I'll sort of take the first one if you don't mind. And speaking of hope, speaking of the challenges of the moment, and as myself, director of a very, 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 very small organization compared to yours, can you talk a little bit about your hope and or strategy for how you might broaden your fundraising base so that you can continue this incredibly important work that is now in its 75th year?
So some of it actually is by working with our less traditional donors. One example is actually the development banks, because when we can connect the migration opportunities with development outcomes and creating jobs, for example, and we see it all the time if we are empowering returning migrants with support to help start a business based on the knowledge that they acquired when they were working abroad, it actually perpetuates a range of new jobs. And this is something that the multinational, the development banks are very interested in supporting. So that has been increasingly a partner for us. Likewise, we do not have a tradition of working with the private sector, but something we're really pushing now, recognizing, that the private sector benefits when migration is well managed. The private sector benefits when there's regional and political stability, when they can make investments, whether it's investing in expanding their businesses or having the capacity they need for a sustainable workforce wherever they might be. The private sector has a lot to win if they are part of creating better migration strategies.
Thank you. Director General. Kevin Appleby here. Good to see you. Thank you very much for being here. As you know, we're experiencing a mass deportation campaign. It's beginning. It hasn't reached its zenith yet, I don't think. And our country is also sending migrants to third countries that they're not familiar with. With all these deportations, one policy which hasn't been discussed as much is reintegration programs in countries of origin, because a lot of these migrants who have been here for years, they probably don't have ties anymore in their countries, and they're just sort of dumped. Has IOM looked at that side of the equation and what an effective reintegration program might look like? And have you received any positive responses from countries who might want to implement that type of program?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've seen that is promising is around community reintegration. If you look at the returns to Syria, for example, the returns to Syria are really successful or not successful, whether the person is going into a community where they have options to rebuild a new life. And when we're looking at a return in Syria, we're thinking about what are the schools like? What are the businesses like? What is the ability for that person to make a new life? If you give a migrant, just $1,000 to go back and reintegrate, you're actually not likely to be, you'll have extraordinary people who are successful, but just giving somebody a bit of money and saying, okay, go do it. We don't have that kind of success. On the other hand, when you're investing in a community, when we're aligning it with support on building businesses, access to capital, support from private sector partners and mentors, we actually see much, much better outcomes. And so what I have found some promising interest, especially from some of our government donors, is to align the returns with their private sector partners in a country where migrants are going back and connecting people into job opportunities. I found it really interesting, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, when I spoke with their finance minister, they said, look, we have very high skilled workers and we have a lot of very uneducated or undereducated workers or people in our economy, but we do not have vocational workers. And what we know of many migrants who are migrating out of West Africa, they're not the poorest of the poor. They're actually people who have some level of education and ambition. And so encouraging the connection we're doing this with the World Bank, we're doing this with some private sector companies, when people are coming back, being connected into some of those job training, vocational training, and then being integrated into the government's own development plan. That's the kind of thing where we think we can see some very positive, meaningful outcomes.
Thank you, Director General. Thank you very much for your time, for your comments, for your remarks, for your optimism and hope. So we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in the future and to continue our work together. Thanks again.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye now.